Beamy Sam, just a regular guy working a 9 to 5 office job. The work wasn't dazzling, just some data analysis for a mid-sized marketing firm. The pay was decent, the hours were stable, and the people were all right. That's all you can really ask for, I guess. Our team was a pretty well-oiled machine for the longest time. There was me, just trying to keep my head down and get my work done. Then there was Theodore, the veteran of the group. He was in his late 50s, had seen it all, and had this calm, unflappable demeanor. He knew every system, every client, and every bit of office politics backwards and forwards. Theodore was the guy you went to when you actually needed a problem solved, not just talked about in a meeting. We also had Kaison, the youngest guy on the team, maybe early 20s. He was sharp, ambitious, and still had that fire to prove himself. A good kid, always willing to lend a hand, especially with the tech stuff that confused some of the older staff. On the other side of the cubicle farm was Isla. She was competent, friendly, and we had a good working relationship. If her computer was acting up, Kazan or I would pop over and fix it. If we needed a second opinion on some client-facing report, she'd give it a look. It was a collaborative environment. No drama, no fuss. If a big delivery of printer paper and water cooler jugs arrived, the guys would just handle it without being asked. It took 5 minutes. Nobody kept score. We were just a team trying to get through the week. This comfortable little ecosystem continued for a couple of years. Then, sometime last spring, our old manager, a reasonable guy named Dave, announced his retirement. We threw him a nice party, wished him well, and then spent a few weeks in a state of mild uncertainty. Corporate sent emails about a new chapter and exciting leadership transitions. We all knew that was just HR speak for get ready for a shakeup. That's when Rosemary arrived. She was introduced on a Monday morning in a company-wide email filled with buzzwords like synergy, paradigm shift, and forward-thinking empowerment. Her professional headshot looked friendly enough, but when she walked into the office, the vibe was different. She had this intense, scanning gaze, like she was cataloging every little imperfection. She didn't smile much, offering only a tight professional nod to people. The first week, she didn't do much. She just observed. She'd walk silently around the office, notepad in hand, watching how we all interacted. You could feel her eyes on your back. Theodore told us to just keep our heads down and work as normal. He figured she was just trying to get the lay of the land. We saw her having closed-door meetings with some of the women from other departments. A few of them would walk out of her office with self-satisfied smirks. Isla, to her credit, just looked uncomfortable when she got called in. The calm before the storm lasted about 2 weeks. Then we all got a calendar invite for a mandatory department meeting titled Departmental Restructuring and Equity Initiative. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, which is never a good sign. We all filed into the main conference room. Rosemary was standing at the front, next to a whiteboard. She had that same tight, unsmiling expression. She started the meeting by talking about her vision for the department. It was a long speech filled with vague corporate jargon about breaking down old structures and fostering a truly inclusive environment. Then she got to the point. She announced she had identified several areas where our office was failing to meet modern standards of workplace equity. To correct this, she was implementing a new set of departmental policies, effective immediately. She turned to the whiteboard and began to write. The first rule was what she called the physical labor reappropriation. She explained that for too long, a disproportionate amount of invisible labor had fallen on women. To compensate for the historical privilege of men not having to carry that burden, all designated physical tasks in the office would now be the exclusive responsibility of male employees. This included everything from moving boxes and changing the water cooler bottle to setting up for meetings and unloading office supplies. It wasn't a request. It was now an official, mandated part of our job descriptions. Theodore just sat there, expressionless, staring straight ahead. Kai-san looked confused. Before anyone could process that, she moved on to the second rule: vacation and leave prioritization. From now on, when scheduling vacation time, female employees would be given absolute priority in any scheduling conflicts. Her reasoning was that women needed time off more to recover from the systemic pressures of a patriarchal society. So, if you and a female colleague both requested the same week in July, her request would be automatically approved, and yours would be denied. You'd have to pick a different time. There was a nervous shuffle in the room. A few guys who had already put in for summer holidays exchanged worried glances. Then came the third and most bizarre rule. Rosemary walked over to her desk and picked up a large empty glass jar, placing it on the conference table for all to see. She called it the mansplaining accountability jar. She defined mansplaining as any instance where a male employee explained a concept to a female employee in a manner that she, Rosemary, deemed condescending or unnecessary. She would be the sole arbiter of what constituted mansplaining. Any infraction would result in the offending male employee placing $5 into the jar. The money, she announced with a triumphant little smile, would be used to fund a women's empowerment lunch at the end of each month. The room was dead silent. We were all just staring at this stupid jar. Finally, she unveiled the fourth rule: emotional labor delegation. She declared that planning and executing all office social events, birthdays, holiday parties, farewell gatherings, was now the official responsibility of the men. This, she explained, was because women are traditionally and unfairly saddled with this emotional labor in both their personal and professional lives. It was time for the men to step up and carry that load. When she finished, she looked around the room, expecting applause or at least nods of agreement. Instead, there was just stunned silence. Kai-san, being young and still believing in rational discourse, raised his hand. He tried to make a polite point, suggesting that maybe tasks should be assigned based on who was available or best suited for them, regardless of gender. He framed it in terms of efficiency and teamwork. Rosemary cut him off mid-sentence. Her face hardened. She told him that his reaction was a textbook example of male fragility and an unwillingness to acknowledge his own privilege. Then she pointed a finger at the jar. "That'll be $5, Kai-san." Kai-san just stared at her, flabbergasted. He pulled out his wallet and put the cash in the jar. The clink of the coins echoed in the silent room. Theodore decided to try a different approach. He spoke up, his voice calm and even. He didn't argue with the premise of her rules. Instead, he asked a practical question about how documenting these new physical tasks would affect our project billing codes and productivity metrics. He was trying to steer the conversation back to the actual work we were paid to do. Rosemary wasn't having it. She accused him of trying to use bureaucratic minutiae to undermine a vital equity initiative. She told him that some things, like justice, couldn't be quantified on a spreadsheet. She didn't make him put money in the jar, but she shut him down completely. After that, no one else dared to speak. The message was clear. There would be no discussion. The meeting ended. We all shuffled out of the conference room like zombies. Isla and a couple of the other women looked mortified, avoiding eye contact with us. A few others, however, looked positively giddy. That afternoon, the men all happened to take a smoke break at the same time, even the non-smokers. We stood outside in a small, miserable circle. Kai-san was fuming. He was talking about going to HR, about how this was clearly discriminatory. I felt the same way, but I also had a sinking feeling that HR would just be a corporate extension of Rosemary's worldview. It was Theodore who calmed everyone down. He took a long drag from his cigarette and looked at us. He told us that fighting her directly was exactly what she wanted. She wanted us to get angry, to argue, to complain. It would feed her narrative of men being resistant to progress. She would document every complaint as an example of our toxic masculinity and use it against us. He said you can't win an argument with a zealot. He told us a story about his time in a unionized factory job when he was younger. He talked about the concept of work to rule or malicious compliance. The strategy wasn't to fight the rules, but to follow them so precisely, so literally, and so completely that the whole system grinds to a halt under the weight of its own stupidity. No more helping out. No more going the extra mile. No more taking initiative. We would do exactly what was in our job description, plus the new rules, and nothing more. We would become the perfect, unthinking cogs in the machine she had designed. A slow, malicious smile spread across Kaisan's face. I felt a surge of something that wasn't quite hope, but was close enough. We made a pact, right then and there. No anger, no arguments, just absolute unwavering compliance. The following Monday was the beginning of the new era. The change was immediate and palpable. The first test came around 10 in the morning. Isla's monitor was flickering. Normally, she'd ask one of us, and Kaisan would have it sorted out in 2 minutes. She looked over at him expectantly. Kaisan, with an expression of pure, polite regret, told her that he couldn't help. He explained that troubleshooting hardware could be considered a technical task, and under the new policies, he wasn't allowed to take on extra duties without direct instruction from Rosemary. He suggested she file an IT support ticket. Isla stared at him, bewildered. The IT department usually took at least 24 hours to respond to minor hardware issues. She ended up having to work with a flickering screen all day. Later that afternoon, a delivery of new office chairs arrived, a huge stack of them in heavy boxes. The delivery guy left them in the reception area. Rosemary walked out of her office, saw the boxes, and then looked pointedly at me, Theodore, and Kaisan. She instructed us to unpack and distribute the new chairs. Under the old regime, we'd have knocked it out in 15 minutes. But now we were following the rules. Theodore immediately started by asking for the proper forms to document an unscheduled physical labor task. Rosemary looked annoyed, but printed them out for us. We spent the next 10 minutes carefully filling them out, documenting the start time, the nature of the task, and the employees involved. Then we began the work, but with an almost comical emphasis on safety protocols. We found the company's workplace safety manual online and followed it to the letter. We cleared a wide perimeter around the boxes. We used box cutters with extreme care, wearing safety gloves we found in the supply closet. We lifted each box using the team lift technique, even the small ones. What should have taken minutes stretched into an hour and a half of billable company time. Our actual project work sat untouched on our desks. Rosemary kept storming out of her office to see what was taking so long. Each time, Theodore would calmly hold up the safety manual and point to the relevant regulation we were following. She couldn't say a word. Her face was turning a fascinating shade of purple. The atmosphere in the office began to change. The easy, collaborative spirit was gone, replaced by a rigid, formal structure. Communication became stilted. During team meetings, the men would say almost nothing. Ideas and suggestions were a form of initiative, and initiative was no longer part of our job. When Rosemary would ask for our input on a project, we would respond with polite non-answers. I'd say something like, "I will need more time to analyze the data before I can offer a conclusion." Theodore would say, "I am still processing the parameters you have provided." Kaisan, a natural brainstormer, sat in complete silence, a blank expression on his face. The mansplaining jar sat on her desk, completely empty after Kaisan's initial contribution. We avoided any conversation with our female colleagues that wasn't strictly necessary for a task. We couldn't risk having an opinion or explaining a process, because Rosemary's definition of mansplaining was entirely subjective. It was safer to just not engage. The women started to notice. At first, it was small things. They now had to deal with all their own minor computer glitches. They had to submit formal requests for things we used to just help them with. The division was no longer just between management and employees. It was a hard line drawn right down the middle of the team. The first office birthday under the new regime was for Isla. As per the emotional labor delegation rule, it was our job to organize it. We approached the task with the same malicious compliance. Theodore drafted a formal proposal and budget, which he submitted to Rosemary for approval. It included line items for a generic sheet cake from the cheapest grocery store, a single pack of paper plates, and one book of matches for the candles. Rosemary approved it without looking closely. On the day of the birthday, we brought in the cake at the designated lunch hour. We placed it in the break room, sent out a department-wide email that simply read, "Cake is in the break room for Isla's birthday," and then went back to our desks. There was no singing, no gathering around her desk, no personalized card. We had fulfilled the requirement, as stated. The emotional part of emotional labor was conspicuously absent. I saw Isla later that day by the coffee machine. She looked sad. She tried to make small talk, but I just gave her a polite, distant smile and a nod before walking away. I felt a little bad, but the rules were the rules. We were just following orders. The friction was starting to build, and Rosemary was at the center of it, getting more and more frustrated. She had designed a system to punish and control the men, but she was discovering that she had only managed to break her own department. The productivity numbers for the month started to come in, and they were bad, very bad. Projects were taking longer. Simple tasks were getting bogged down in the new, rigid processes we had adopted. She couldn't blame us. Our individual performance reviews showed we were completing every task that was officially assigned to us. We were doing our jobs exactly as instructed. All the extra stuff, the grease that makes the wheels of an office turn, the initiative, the cooperation, the quick favors, that had all vanished, and its absence was creating a massive drag on everything. She tried to address it in another meeting, this time talking about the importance of proactive engagement and being a team player. She didn't mention her rules, of course. She just talked around them. We all sat there, nodding politely, taking notes. And then we went back to our desks and changed absolutely nothing. We could feel that a major collision was inevitable. The current situation was unsustainable. A department can't function when half of its most experienced members are essentially quiet quitting in place. We were waiting for the big one, a project so important, so time-sensitive, that our passive resistance would cause a full-blown crisis she couldn't ignore. We didn't have to wait long. Word came down from corporate about the annual Q3 client portfolio review. It was the biggest project of the quarter. It was complex, required a massive amount of data crunching, and always involved long hours and all hands-on-deck collaboration to get it done on time. In previous years, this project was our time to shine as a team. This year, it was going to be her reckoning. Rosemary announced the project in a team meeting, trying to sound motivational. She talked about the challenge ahead and her confidence in our ability to deliver. Theodore, Kaison, and I just looked at each other. No one said a word. We just waited for our orders. A storm was coming, and we were standing right in the middle of it, holding a lightning rod. And it was all according to her design. The Q3 portfolio review was a beast. It involved weeks of work, pulling analytics from dozens of campaigns, compiling them into a coherent narrative, and then building a presentation that top-level management could understand. It was the kind of project that required flexibility and constant communication. Rosemary kicked it off by sending out a single vague email with the project brief attached. In the past, we'd have immediately huddled up, broken the project down into manageable parts, and started collaborating. This time, we did nothing. We waited. After about half a day of silence, Rosemary came out of her office looking irritated. She asked why no one had started. Theodore calmly replied that we were awaiting specific task assignments, as per the new departmental structure. We didn't want to overstep or take initiative that wasn't sanctioned. Her jaw tightened. She retreated back into her office. An hour later, a flood of emails came through. She had broken down the project into dozens of tiny, granular tasks and assigned each one individually. It was a micromanagement nightmare, but it was exactly what we wanted. We each replied to our respective emails, confirming receipt of the instructions, and then began our work. The inefficiency was staggering. If my task was to pull engagement metrics for client X from May, I would do exactly that. I would export the raw data into a spreadsheet and attach it to an email, marking the task as complete. I wouldn't analyze it. I wouldn't cross-reference it with the data from April. I wouldn't identify the obvious anomaly in the numbers that any competent analyst would spot. My instructions were to pull the data, not to interpret it. Interpretation could be mansplaining. Kaisan's job was to integrate these spreadsheets into a master file. He'd get my file, and then Theodore's, and then data from a dozen other sources. But because we weren't allowed to coordinate, the formatting was always different. He would then have to send a formal email request to Rosemary, asking for permission to standardize the data formats. Rosemary, who didn't understand the technical side of our work, would have to call a meeting to understand the problem. A 10-minute conversation between me and Kaisan was replaced by a 3-hour process involving emails, requests, and meetings. This happened dozens of times a day. The project, which should have been moving forward, was drowning in a sea of bureaucratic sludge that she herself had created. The women on the team were getting crushed. They were trying to do the collaborative part of the project, writing the narrative, building the presentation, but the data they were getting from us was raw, disjointed, and late. Isla came over to my desk one afternoon. She looked exhausted. She asked if I could just quickly explain a trend she was seeing in the numbers I sent her. I felt a pang of the old teamwork spirit. I wanted to help her. But I looked over at Rosemary's office, where the empty jar sat like a silent threat. I politely told Isla that I could only provide the data as requested. Any analysis would have to be formally requested through Rosemary. "Sam, this is insane," she whispered. "We're going to fail." "We're just following the rules, Isla," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "The new rules." She just shook her head and walked away. The invisible wall between us was now a foot thick. The first major deadline approached, the preliminary data submission. It was a Thursday. We were nowhere near ready. The master file Kaisan was building was a corrupted mess of unnormalized data. At 4:45 p.m., Rosemary came rushing out of her office. She was in full panic mode. She announced that the team needed to stay late to get the preliminary data ready. It wasn't a request. At 5 p.m. on the dot, I started shutting down my computer. Theodore was already packing his briefcase. Kaisan was putting on his jacket. Rosemary stood in the middle of the office, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. "Where are you going?" she demanded. Theodore looked at her, then pointedly at his watch. "It's 5 o'clock, Rosemary. End of the workday." "This project is critical. I expect my team to do what it takes to get the job done," she said, her voice rising. "Our employment contracts stipulate a workday from 9 to 5, Theodore said calmly. "And the new policies you implemented make no mention of mandatory overtime. We are fulfilling our contractual obligations." She stared at him, speechless. She was being beaten with her own rule book. The three of us walked out, leaving her in the middle of the office with a half-finished, disastrous project and a team of overwhelmed female employees. The next morning, The atmosphere was toxic. Rosemary had clearly stayed late with the women, trying to salvage the work. They all looked like they hadn't slept. She sent out a furious email about lack of commitment and unprofessional attitudes. We read it, archived it, and continued our work to rule. The next 2 weeks were a slow-motion train wreck. The project fell further and further behind schedule. Rosemary's behavior became more erratic. One day she'd be threatening us with performance reviews. The next she'd be trying to give awkward, insincere, motivational speeches. Nothing worked. We were a wall of polite, unassailable compliance. We continued to leave at 5 p.m. every single day. The final deadline was a Friday. On Wednesday of that week, it was clear to everyone that the project was dead in the water. The presentation was a skeleton, the data was incomplete, and the analysis was non-existent. Rosemary called a final, desperate team meeting. She didn't even pretend to be motivational this time. She looked defeated. She accused us indirectly of not being team players. She talked about how some people were putting their own interests ahead of the company's. We just sat there, listening patiently. We didn't defend ourselves. We didn't have to. The project was officially submitted on Friday. It was an embarrassment. We all knew what was coming next. A failure of this magnitude wouldn't go unnoticed. The following week was eerily quiet. Rosemary stayed in her office, the door closed. Then, on a Tuesday morning, we saw him, the director, the big boss from corporate. He didn't usually visit our floor. When he did, it meant something was very wrong. He walked straight into Rosemary's office. He didn't close the door all the way. We couldn't hear everything, but we heard snippets. Words like unacceptable, catastrophic failure, and explain this. After about 20 minutes, Rosemary's voice rose to a near shout. We heard her mention a culture of toxic masculinity and a coordinated campaign of sabotage. She was throwing us under the bus, just as Theodore had predicted. A moment later, the director's assistant came out and told me, Theodore and Kaizen, that the director wanted to see us in the main conference room, now. This was it, the final act. We walked into the conference room. The director was sitting at the head of the table, his face like stone. Rosemary was sitting at the far end, looking smug and vindicated. The director got straight to the point. He said he had just heard a very serious accusation from Rosemary. He said she claimed the three of us had deliberately undermined a critical company project as an act of insubordination. He asked for our response. Rosemary was watching us, a triumphant glint in her eye. She thought she had us cornered. Theodore gestured for me to speak. For the past several weeks, I had been the unofficial record keeper. I took a deep breath and placed my file folder on the table. I spoke calmly and factually. I didn't use emotional language. I just stated the facts. Sir, I began, we did not sabotage any project. We have simply been following the new departmental policies implemented by Ms. Rosemary since her arrival. I opened the folder. The first document I pushed across the table was the original email from Rosemary, outlining the 4 new rules. I had printed it out. I pointed to each rule and explained how it had impacted our workflow. I explained that the physical labor reappropriation rule meant we had to stop our primary work for extended periods to perform tasks that were previously shared. I explained that the fear of the mansplaining jar had forced us to cease all informal collaboration and brainstorming with our female colleagues, as any unsolicited advice could be penalized. Next, I showed him a thick stack of printed emails. It was a record of every single task request we had sent to Rosemary, every request for clarification, every time we had to stop work on one thing to wait for her approval on another. It was a perfect, documented timeline of the inefficiency she had built. As you can see, I said, we did not proceed on any task without explicit written instructions from our manager. We were trying to be extremely careful to follow her directives. Then, I pulled out the final document. It was a copy of our standard employment contract, with the section on working hours highlighted, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Rosemary accused us of refusing to work overtime, I said. However, overtime was never formally requested in writing, and it is not a mandatory part of our contracts. We fulfilled our required hours every single day. I concluded by looking the director in the eye. We did not act with malice. We simply complied with the new operating procedures of our department. The failure of this project is a direct result of those procedures. The conference room was silent. Rosemary's smug expression had melted away, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed shock. She had nothing, no rebuttal. I had used her own words, her own rules, against her. The director looked from the pile of documents to Rosemary's face, and then back again. He didn't need any more convincing. The evidence was undeniable. He looked at Rosemary, and his voice was cold as ice. Rosemary, you have created a hostile and unproductive environment. You have implemented discriminatory policies that have crippled your own team and cost this company a significant amount of money. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. He told her to clean out her desk and that security would escort her from the building. She just sat there for a moment, stunned, before getting up and walking out of the room without another word. The director then looked at us. He looked at Theodore. "Theodore," he said, "this department needs a manager who understands how to get work done. I'm making you the interim department head. Your job is to get things back on track." Theodore just gave a simple, dignified nod. We walked out of the conference room and back to our desks. The entire office had been watching through the glass walls. They knew. As I sat down, Isla walked over. She stood there for a second, then just said, "I'm sorry. We should have spoken up." "It's okay," I said. "It's over now." And it was. The next day, Theodore was in the manager's office. The first thing he did was send out an email. The subject line was, "Rescinding previous departmental policies." The body of the email just said that all special rules implemented over the past few months were now void. The department was returning to a model based on teamwork and mutual respect. And just like that, the office started to heal. People started talking to each other again. We started helping each other out. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere was gone. The stupid glass jar on Rosemary's old desk vanished. No one knew who took it, and no one asked. Things aren't perfect, but they're normal again. We get our work done. We function as a team. We learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes the best way to fight a stupid system isn't to break the rules, but to follow them until the system breaks itself.